Good day. Before I proceed with this video, can I again offer apologies for the fact that I continue to suffer from this head cold. As you can see, more of my voice is back every day. I'm still having problems with this cold, which hasn't yet fully lifted. It's a typical London cold. I get these things every year, and long ago I decided that the only way to deal with them was to just plow on. So, with apologies if my voice is indistinct and my eyes look sometimes a bit watery and flushed, but for all that, as I said, I think the best thing to do is simply to continue with the programs. And again, thanks to everyone who has been writing to me expressing concern. There's no cause for concern. As I said, I'm always prone to head colds, and I have always been getting them at this time of year. And secondly, thanks also for your various suggestions as to things to do to abate the symptoms. And I've been following some of the advice, and definitely in certain cases it has helped. Anyway, let's proceed with the news of today. And the news is becoming more and more momentous with almost every passing day. And I, for one, am developing a growing sense of foreboding about where 2024 is heading. I don't want to sound too ominous. There's all sorts of positive things also going on. But in the Middle East, where I shall go first, things don't look to be going at all well. Now, around a week ago, I don't remember exactly when, and I don't exactly remember where, I read an article, I think it was in the Financial Times. I discussed it extensively in one of my programs for this channel. I commented on the article in detail. I remember reading an article in which various US officials, senior Biden administration officials, had spoken to the Financial Times. There seemed to be a general wringing of hands, a sense that the situation in the Middle East was getting completely out of control. The administration was becoming worried that more and more problems were piling up in the Middle East, and they didn't really know what to do. That they were worried about the fact that large parts of the US fleet were tied down in the Gulf of Aden and off Yemen, and not doing very much of any particular value. They were worried that the operation in Gaza that Israel launched appears to be continuing almost indefinitely with no clear end in sight. They were worried about the conflict, a potential conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they were also very worried indeed about the fact that there'd been multiple attacks on US bases across the Middle East in places like Syria and Iraq. And the article specifically mentioned that the administration, for the moment, has been able to contain the dangers of an all-out escalation in the Middle East, because up to that point, no Americans had been killed. But if Americans were killed in one of these attacks on the bases, then the situation could easily spiral out of control, and the United States could find itself in a wider war. Now, looking back, and I didn't, as I recall, think of this at the time, that article ought to have raised alarm bells, because there are plenty of people, of course, who do want to see a wider war in the Middle East, and some of them are powerful, and some of them are violent. And some of these people are to be found in Washington and in Western governments. but there's also an awful lot of people of that kind in the Middle East itself. And of course, these people read newspapers, and they might have, for all I know, read that article in the Financial Times. I'm not saying they did, by the way. And they might have said to themselves, well, you know, we want a wider war in the Middle East. We want a crisis between the United States and Iran. So what we need to do is to arrange for Americans to be killed, for Iran to get the blame, and we will then likely get what we want. And again, I want to stress, I don't know that this is necessarily what happened, but a short time later, after that article appears, here we are today in the aftermath of an attack on an American base in the Middle East. 3 Americans have been killed, many more have been injured, number over 30. Tragedy for the soldiers who have been killed and for their families. Bad news, undoubtedly, for these soldiers who have been wounded, and one hopes that most of them will come through and that their wounds will not be serious. In fact, one hopes that all of them will come through and their wounds will not be serious. But anyway, here we are, just a short time after the media, perhaps probably the Financial Times, was being briefed by Biden administration officials that the killing of Americans would be a red line and would make inevitable a powerful American reaction. Well, here we are, and that red line has now been crossed, and we're all waiting to see what that powerful American reaction is going to be. Now, when I say that there are lots of violent and dangerous people in the Middle East and elsewhere who probably do want a wider war, I want to make it very clear that I have a completely open mind about who they might be. I am not pointing fingers at any particular party. I think you will find people who want a wider war on every side in this conflict. I think you will find them amongst the various militias. Certainly you will find them amongst the Houthis. Conceivably, there are some people in Iran who would not be averse to a wider war because they might think that that will enlarge Iranian interests, though I suspect that in Iran, such people are relatively few and the government has them relatively under control. And of course, there are people who want a wider war in Israel as well, and as I said, in other countries, including in the United States. I am not saying that any particular party, I have in mind any particular party as carrying out this attack. I don't have any information about this attack, and I'm not in any position to point fingers and say that this was carried out by one party as opposed to another, and I'm not necessarily even saying that it was done with a specific purpose of triggering a wider war. It might have been that whoever did it just wants to kill Americans. There are plenty of people in the Middle East like that as well. But anyway, here we are. And one of the things that does make me wonder whether the appearance of that article in the Financial Times and this attack on this base are unconnected to each other is the fact that there are questions, at least in my mind, about this particular attack. Now, we at the Duran have the benefit of being in touch with various individuals who have a lot more experience of this kind of thing than we do. Several of them are members of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, one of the best institutions around, in my opinion, in the United States. They're the kind of people who provide really outstanding advice, assessments of things, of events, which in effect they're offering to the President of the United States. And one of the most frustrating things is that you see that these veteran members of the US intelligence community have an unerring habit of giving the correct advice and giving the correct warnings to the US government, which the US government then simply disregards. And I've often been left to wonder whether all the good people in US intelligence now are retired and work for VIPs, as I shall call it from now on, or whether in fact there are still people in the intelligence community, the actual serving intelligence community, who are switched on as the people at VIPs are. Now, I would say that VIPs, by the way, has provided another of its series of outstanding intelligence assessments. This was provided just a few days ago. I think it appeared about a week ago, and you can find it on Consortium News, and it points out to the fact that pretty much every piece of advice that has been followed by the US government in the conflict in Ukraine specifically has turned out to be wrong, and that a change of course, a radical change of course, is needed. And of course, on Ukraine, as on virtually every other issue, VIPS has been proved to be completely correct. Well, we've been fortunate that, as I said, that we are acquainted with people from VIPS. One of them is Larry Johnson. And we were in contact with Larry Johnson, who is a former former officer of the CIA. And he has made us, we had a discussion with him. And of course, I should quickly add that Larry is somebody who obviously has his contacts in the intelligence world. I have no knowledge about that. I'm not going to try and guess about this, but I'm assuming, I think it's a reasonable guess, that when he tells us things, he's not just drawing on his experience, massive though that is, actual experience of covert operations and intelligence analysis and assessment, but he's probably able to get information which, to be frank, to be straightforward about it, is not accessible to people like me. Anyway, Larry made a point, which is that if you follow the events in the Ukraine war, where drones are used on a regular basis by both armies, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, it would be extremely unusual indeed for a single drone to be able to do the damage, to kill and wound as many people as are supposed to have been killed and wounded in the attack on this base. And the official story from the US government is that this attack was undertaken by a drone. Now, I follow closely events in Ukraine, and I can say conclusively, without any doubt, that about this, Larry is absolutely correct. He's completely right. And I should say, this is something I've got from Larry, I've got it from other people as well. There is, to my mind, something deeply illogical about this strike taking place in Jordan. This is about the one country in the region, Arab country in the region, which has tight control of its territory. In Syria, in Iraq, even in Lebanon. Not that I know of any American bases in Lebanon. If a drone attack took place on an American base, well, it would not surprise me. But a drone attack on an American base in Jordan does surprise me very much indeed. And I understand that there are rumors that the attack was not actually on an American base in Jordan at all, but that it might have been on an American base in Syria. And of course, the base that people are apparently talking about is Al-Tanf, which is this base located in western Syria, not far from the Jordanian border. It's come under multiple intense pressure from the Syrian authorities, who are very unhappy about its presence. The Russians are unhappy about its presence as well. There have been incidents close to this base, and it would be an obvious location for an attack like this to take place. Now, let me stress, this is rumor and supposition about the fact that drones don't usually cause devastation on this level. About that, I agree completely with Larry. He is right about the possibility that this was actually happened in an attack in Syria, in an attack on a base in Syria rather than Jordan. About that, I know absolutely nothing, and I am not so sure. But anyway, the fact that there are lots of rumors about this attack and that there are unanswered questions, at least to my mind, about it, that takes me back to my original point that I do seriously wonder whether there isn't more to this story than we're being told, and whether there might even be a connection with the fact that some people in the American government made the actually, with hindsight, astonishing decision to slip out the news that the killing of Americans would be regarded by the United States as a red line. Given that, as I have said, there are plenty of people, many people of different affiliations and opinions in the Middle East who probably would want to cross such a red line in order to provoke a wider war. Anyway, here we are. We are now all waiting anxiously for what the United States is now going to do. And, well, all of the reports suggest that some kind of counterstrike by the United States is now all but inevitable. All the usual suspects, Lindsey Graham and all the others, have now been urgently calling for strikes on Iran. The President of the United States has, in my opinion, most unwisely come out and straightforwardly said that the party which was behind the attack was Iran. Iran has, of course, denied that it was party to the attack. Again, given that the Iranians have been going out of their way to try to avoid a wider war in the Middle East, and I've discussed in many programs why, given the fact that their economy is now booming, their diplomatic contacts with various countries have been improving, given that they're just about to join the BRICS or have actually done so, it makes no sense to me to think that the Iranians would want a war, a wider war between themselves and the Americans at this time. But all of that, apparently, all those concerns, all that thinking has gone to waste. At least nobody in Washington seems to be thinking about it. It is being taken as axiomatic there that Iran was behind this attack, and the president has now said so. And of course, as far as the Washington bureaucracy is concerned, the military, the civilian figures, and the Pentagon, if the president says it, well, then it must be true. So, some kind of an attack on an Iranian target is now inevitable, and it is going to be a bigger attack than the ones we have seen up to now. There's been many American attacks on all kinds of militias that are in alliance with Iran, and which the United States claims are Iranian proxies. There's been constant missile and airstrikes upon the Houthis, the Houthi militia in Yemen, but something presumably bigger is now coming, and it will presumably target an agency or an asset that is indisputably Iranian. Now, I've chosen my words very carefully because I suspect that there are still voices in Washington saying that the United States needs to act in a measured way, that a uncontrolled escalation of the situation in the Middle East is not in US interests, and that the United States doesn't need another war in the Middle East on top of the war in Ukraine, and is hardly in a good position to conduct such a war, and therefore that it needs to act in a way that it can step back from. And as I said, I have no doubt that these voices exist, but I also strongly suspect that the other voices, the voices that want a much bigger escalation, are also there and are speaking out. And given that a red line has been crossed, a red line which the administration or the officials of the administration were very foolish, by the way, to publicize. Well, given that a red line has been crossed, they will be calling for the biggest possible escalation that can take place. And that means, of course, some kind of a direct strike on Iran itself. And we have to be prepared for that possibility. I should say that even if the United States does try to calibrate its response, striking at some Iranian target outside Iran, the risk is that the Iranians themselves will then be forced or feel compelled to respond in kind, and we could get an escalation anyway. But I can't help but think that the probabilities are that an uncontrolled escalation is indeed coming. And can I say that this is all completely predictable? It's been discussed for many months now on these programs. The failure to resolve the crisis in Gaza has almost set the scene for what we have just seen. The idea that you can control the situation in the Middle East and prevent other things from happening and try to limit the violence to Gaza was plainly unrealistic. And the huge deployments of American forces in the Middle East, which it is quite clear are not deterring anybody from doing anything, on the contrary, were almost an invitation for military action, both against the Americans and by them. Well, we shall see. We shall see whether the United States now makes the fatal decision of striking at Iran and what the strike is. The fact that there has been no strike up to this point is not a good sign. It suggests that the United States is working hard, looking at options, and is preparing perhaps for the most powerful strike that it can make, which of course by definition would take several days to plan and prepare for. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. On one thing I am sure, a strike on Iran, if that is what happens, or even a strike on a lesser target, might make some people happy, but it will resolve nothing. It will not deter the various parties from continuing their fighting in the Middle East On the contrary, it will simply escalate the situation in the Middle East. It is far more likely to light the fuse, or if you want to change the metaphor, provoke a chain reaction, than to stabilize the situation. The reason we are here, and I want to say this again, is because American diplomacy in the Middle East, since the events on 7th October, when Hamas attacked Israel, has been essentially absent. The United States gave Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government a blank check. That has now led to a terrible humanitarian tragedy in Gaza itself, without the military victory against Hamas having been achieved, at least not up to now. It has led to this decision by the International Court of Justice, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, Francis Boyle, a lawyer who has argued cases before the ICJ, has set out the kind of action that the United Nations and the General Assembly might take based upon that decision of the ICJ. And of course, it has now led us into a situation where Americans have been killed and where there is every reason to think that there is going to be a further escalation, a massive upward spiral of violence in the Middle East. I cannot imagine myself that this chaotic sleepwalking into this disaster was planned. I know some people think that, but I do not. It seems to me that this administration, divided as it is between various factions, with a president in charge who seems to have difficulty in making final decisions and agreeing clear policies, that this administration is losing control of the situation because they are not willing to do the necessary things that would have brought the whole situation in the Middle East under control, of which backing a ceasefire in Gaza now is one. And the result is that we are in the ominous situation that I discussed at the start of this program. Well, that is all I'm going to say about it. No doubt we will get more news at some point over the next couple of days. When we do, I will come back and I will discuss the situation further. Let me now turn to that other conflict which the United States has been intimately involved in and which is also going disastrously wrong, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And let me do as I traditionally do, though there have been times when I've acted otherwise, and which is I'm going to briefly start with a discussion of the situation on the battlefronts. And as I have said in recent programs, what we're seeing is aggressive attrition by the Russians. I understand, by the way, that this expression, aggressive attrition, has been translated into Russian by someone and has been appearing in various places in the Russian media and the Russian internet. If so, nobody asked me. Well, perhaps someone else thought of it too. Anyway, we're seeing more aggressive attrition by the Russians. And we see further signs of Ukrainian defenses all along the line of contact starting to buckle. Now, yesterday was a particularly rich day in terms of news about what is going on the battlefronts. The first is that there was a report yesterday that the Russians had again crossed over from their border, struck deep into Kharkov region, and there was even a claim that they'd captured or at least entered a town called Volchansk, which is not far from the Ukraine's border with Russia. I don't believe this report. I should say this straight away. I've seen no evidence that this is the case. There's been lots of rumors about it, but until I see a lot more confirmation, I'm going to treat this story with deep skepticism. This is an area where the Russians were supposed about a week ago to have entered Ukraine and occupied a border village. I never saw any confirmation of this. Several people are pointing out that if you were to advance to Volchansk, control of this border village would be the way leading up to Volchansk, and they assume that this somehow, or some people seem to think that this might lend credence to the original claim that that border village had been captured. But I've seen no evidence that this border village has been captured. The Russian Ministry of Defense has said nothing about it. I've seen no photos, no information that I can safely attribute to people from the battlefronts. And I just generally don't believe these stories. Someone is circulating rumors and reports about Russian advances into Kharkiv region, from the northern borders. I suspect this is more a psychological war operation, which makes it likely that whoever that is probably acting in the Russian interest. But, as I said, I am skeptical about these reports. About the situation around Kupiansk, by contrast, there is no reason to be skeptical at all, because even whilst the Russian Defense Ministry maintains a stony silence about the intense fighting that is going on around Avdiivka, it is actually being somewhat forthcoming about what is going on around Kupiansk. So yesterday I mentioned that there were reports that the Russians had captured a village called Tabayevka in this area, in the area southeast of Kupiansk. I would say before I proceed that as Mikael Valtersen, the Swedish officer who is a retired officer, who now has a most interesting thread on X discussing the war. Anyways, he's pointed out it's actually a stretch to call Tabayevka a village. It's an isolated place consisting of a few houses and a number of farm buildings. It is tiny. So let's not place too much weight on the capture by the Russians of this particular place. In and of itself, it is all but insignificant. But anyway, there were those reports yesterday that Tabayevka had been captured by the Russians. And yesterday, the Russians released a military bulletin, this is the Defense Ministry, about the situation in the area of Kupiansk. And they said, in Kupiansk direction, units of the Zapad group of forces, supported by artillery and heavy flamethrower systems, these are the TOS ones, have improved the situation along the front line. 6 attacks by assault groups of 25th Assault, 32nd and 60th Mechanized and 95th Air Assault brigades of the Ukrainian military have been repulsed close to Sinkovka, Novosyokovskoye, and Tyorny. And the enemy losses were up to 150 troops, 3 motor vehicles, and 1 Gvozdika and self-propelled artillery system. So, by the standards of the fighting in Kupiansk, that gives an impression of quite heavy fighting. Up to 150 Ukrainian soldiers killed and wounded over the course of yesterday. This is according to the Russians. And then early this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry published another report, and they said that in Kupiansk direction, units of the Zapad group of forces liberated Tabayevka, as I said, these small group of houses and farm buildings. The 3 attacks launched by assault detachments of the Ukrainian military's 30th and 32nd Mechanized Brigades were repelled near Sinkovka. Ukrainian losses amounted to up to 30 Ukrainian troops, 2 armored fighting vehicles, 3 pickup trucks, and 1 Star B howitzer. So, an uptick in fighting in the Kupiansk area. The Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that Tabayevka has indeed been captured. The place as itself is insignificant. It is an inconsequential hamlet. There are heights to the west of Tabayevka. Tabayevka itself is said to be in the low ground. It's been suggested that if the Russians capture Tabayevka, it is insufficient. They need to capture the heights as well. I suspect that the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry has now officially reported the capture of Tabayevka, I suspect that that is a sign that the heights to the west of Tabayevka had been captured as well. Now, you will notice that there was an uptick in the fighting. 150 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded in this sector of the battlefield over the course of yesterday. A further 30 killed today. But it does seem from various reports, however, that this uptick in the fighting doesn't just involve Tabayevka, that the Russians are in the process of capturing a string of villages in this area and improving their tactical position in preparation for an advance towards the Oskol River, intended to bypass Sinkovka and outflank Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk. It is still necessary, or so it seems to me, to keep this fighting in Kupiansk, around Kupiansk, to maintain some sense of proportion about it. 150 Ukrainian soldiers killed and wounded yesterday in the fighting in Kupiansk, in the area close to Kupiansk. Compare that with the number of Ukrainian troops killed or wounded, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, in the area, in the Bakhmut area. 330. And today, the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that 30 Ukrainian troops were killed in the Bakhmut area. The number of killed or wounded in the Bakhmut area. The number of Ukrainian troops that the Russian Defense Ministry says were killed or wounded in the Bakhmut area today was 210. However intense the fighting near Kupiansk is, it is dwarfed by what is continuing to happen in and around Bakhmut. And that, by the way, has been the consistent story since the start of 2023. The main area where the most intense fighting has been, at least if you track casualty figures published by the Russian Defense Ministry, not its own casualty figures, but the ones it attributes to Ukraine. The main area of fighting has been and continues to be around Bakhmut. And that, again, points to the significance of Bakhmut, of the area around Bakhmut, both for the Ukrainians and for the Russians. Now, as it happens, we got few details yesterday and today about what was actually going on in Bakhmut, despite the very intense fighting that does appear to be continuing to be happening there. But it does seem as if the Russians are continuing to grind down the Ukrainians in Ivanivska and Bogdanovka and are gradually pushing forward towards this other territory, the Popovka forest, which lies to the west of Bakhmut, and the control of which is also expected to facilitate Russian advances towards Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar itself, by the way, has apparently been bombed practically out of existence. So the fighting in Bakhmut continues. The Ukrainians are continuing to pay a fearful loss for their desperate efforts to try to hold back the Russian tide in Bakhmut. There's said to be 85,000 Russian troops operating in and around Bakhmut. Probably that is still the single most intense and bloody area of the fighting. Now, there is something else happening, and it is intriguing because just as yesterday, the big story, at least in terms of the headlines, was in Kupiansk, and we see that Dubayevka was indeed captured, and the Russians seem to be gaining control of villages, and they appear to be digging in and preparing for a strike towards the Oskol River. Anyway, even as that fighting was going on, there's been a massive sudden uptick in fighting in the Liman area. Now, today, the Russians said that 280 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded in the fighting in the Liman area. Much more than the number of Ukrainian troops who were killed and wounded in the Kupiansk area, both today and yesterday. And unusually, the level of casualties that the Russians claim that the Ukrainians suffered in the Liman area today is higher than the level of casualties the Russians say the Ukrainians suffered in the Bakhmut area. So 280 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded in the Liman area, 210 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded today in the Bakhmut area. And again, there have been lots of reports about Russian advances in all sorts of places in the Liman area. One gets the impression that the Russians are now working hard towards finally cracking Ukrainian defenses in this area. They seem to be moving steadily towards capturing some more of the Ukrainian villages and crossing points on the Zherebets River, and it looks as if they're also working towards the final capture of, or rather the eventual capture of Siversk, and ultimately, I suspect, of Liman itself, Krasny Liman, as the Russians refer to it, a town that they briefly held between May and October 2022, when the Ukrainians were able to recapture it at the end of their Kharkiv offensive, while the Russians steadily are coming back. The Ukrainians are trying to resist them, and they are experiencing extremely heavy losses doing so. What this shows is how the pressure from the Russians is growing they're able to they keep the pressure up in Bakhmut, in the area of Bakhmut, on the Ukrainians all the time, but they're gradually increasing the pressure around Kupiansk, around Liman. Apparently, Ukraine has transferred many of its few remaining Leopard 2 tanks to the Kupiansk area to try to plug the holes there. This, of course, works exactly to the purposes of the Russians. There have been pictures of at least 2 of these tanks being struck by drones, and as I said, the pressure in these northern part of the front lines is increasing. Now, again, there is that major hole in Russian reports, Russian Defense Ministry reports. If you want to know what is going on in Avdiivka, then don't bother to go to the Russian Defense Ministry's reports, because the Russian Defense Ministry will tell you absolutely nothing about it. They haven't mentioned Avdiivka for quite a while. We've been hearing all about these intense battles that are taking place in the southern outskirts of Avdiivka, about the desperate Ukrainian counterattacks that have been happening in this area of Avdiivka as the Ukrainians try desperately either to push the Russians back from moving into central Avdiivka, or if they can't do that, at least to hold the line there. And we are also getting now more and more reports of further Russian advances in Pervomaisky, this village to the southwest of Avdiivka, and northwards from Krasnogorovka towards Keramik. Ukrainian lines becoming increasingly stretched. The Ukrainians suffering, one suspects, extremely heavy losses. There was claims a couple of days ago that the Ukrainians lost the equivalent of 1 brigade. That would be around, one battalion. That would be between 300 to 500 men in 1 day of fighting in one particular sector of Avdiivka as they tried to recapture the Tsar's hunting lodge area, which the Russians had captured a few days before. And as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry tells us nothing. Overall, my sense is, again, that the situation around Avdiivka is becoming steadily more difficult for the Ukrainians. They're hanging on as best they can, and they're clearly increasingly suffering from shell hunger, here as everywhere else on the battlefronts. By the way, I reread Max Hastings' article in the London Times, and I found that he did in fact say that Ukraine would finally run out of artillery shells by the end of February, unless large supplies of artillery shells were provided before then. There's no word, by the way, about where all those artillery shells are supposed to come from. There's some talk about increasing production, but it seems that production in Europe has hardly started. I've discussed in my programs the problems that artillery production in the United States is running into. And Brian Boletic, by the way, has done a really good program on this very topic, which you can also check out. It's his most recent video on the new Atlas. But anyway, Ukrainians suffering increasing shell hunger in Avdiivka and clinging on. And I'm going to make a suggestion that if it is indeed the case, as Ukrainian sources claim, that Ukraine is now losing around 1,200 men a day, dead and wounded, along the battlefronts, then a very large proportion of these casualties are being suffered in Avdiivka. Avdiivka is becoming a meat grinder, exactly in the same way that Bakhmut became for the Ukrainian army. And to a great extent, that is what the Russians are using this battle for. The Ukrainians have decided that Avdiivka must be held, just as previously they decided that Bakhmut must be held. They've decided since then that Bakhmut, even though they've lost Bakhmut, they can't surrender the territory close to Bakhmut, so they are desperately resisting in places like Bogdanovka and Ivanivska, and presumably before long Chasov Yar. They're suffering fearful casualties trying to defend Bakhmut, and exactly the same, or rather this area around Bakhmut, and exactly the same is now happening in Avdiivka. In fact, there are Ukrainian telegram channels, Resident and Legitimi and all of these, that are making exactly that very same point. Now, from the Ukrainian point of view, it's not just Avdiivka and Bakhmut and the crisis in the north. There are other places where things are not going well for them. There's been more reports that the Russians have also made significant advances in the Marinka area, that they've improved their positions around Novomikhailovka and Pobyeda, these two villages that they're also working to capture. We've heard less about the Russian advance towards Kurakhovo via this other village of Georgievka. And of course, the Russians are also apparently now fighting the Ukrainians again in Rabotino. I discussed this extensively a short time yesterday, and it seems that they're also heavily bombing the Ukrainian forces in Kherson region. There's many pictures now of big FAV bombs hitting Ukrainian positions. One can see the attrition taking place all the time. And of course, Ukraine has no real response. They have no real plan, as Max Hastings pointed out, without clear indications of support from the West. They have no real way to develop a plan that can deliver them, that can secure them survival, let alone victory. And I understand that there is an actual article in the Washington Post, I haven't read it, which actually says that most Ukrainians, or at least not most Ukrainians, but that feeling in Ukraine has now gradually turned to despair, and that Ukrainians no longer believe that victory over Russia is possible. Well, if so, they don't seem yet to have any clear idea politically about what to do. There is no available strategy that can change the trajectory of this conflict. I've discussed why Western help is going to start to run down inevitably from this point on, and Ukraine has excluded from itself the option of pursuing a political strategy to end the war, which would need negotiations with the Russians. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, it seems to me that emotionally, at least, Putin has crossed a line. His words in St. Petersburg, his linkage of the conflict in Ukraine with the events of the Second World War and with the siege of Leningrad specifically, are going to make it psychologically very difficult for him to negotiate with the Ukrainians from this point on, even if they were to come and ask to sit down with him and to negotiate with him. I think we've now reached that stage where if such an offer from Ukraine were to come, my guess is that at the very least, Putin will say, look, if you're serious about negotiations, then the first thing you've got to do, other than scrap this law that Zelensky passed forbidding negotiations with Russia, the next thing you've got to do, the first thing you've got to do, in fact, is you've got to change your government in Kiev. You've got to completely reconstitute your government to bring more rational and sensible people in, people who are uncontaminated by Maidan and who can convincingly repudiate its ideology, and with whom we can actually sit down and negotiate. And one can imagine a few such people in Ukraine. Yulia Tymoshenko, whom I talked about about a week ago, could be such a person possibly, though I don't think the Russians trust her very much. Viktor Medvedchuk, who is now in Moscow, apparently, former Ukrainian opposition leader, might be another such person. But it would require a fundamental change in the Ukrainian power structure, one as extensive as that, for Putin to take any negotiations, any proposals from the Ukrainians at all seriously. And to be frank, given the realities, the political realities in Kiev today, I can't actually imagine such a change happening. Even if General Zelensky were to mount a coup against President Zelensky, it seems to me that Zelensky himself is far too compromised at this point to be accepted by the Russians as an interlocutor that they can speak with. And the various politicians who seem to be supporting Zelensky, people like Poroshenko, the former oligarch, the oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, I can't imagine the Russians negotiating in earnest with them. I can't imagine that Putin would agree to negotiate with these people either. Anyway, there we are. So that's where we are in terms of the war and the political situation. But I've been saying that Putin himself has been very busy, and at the moment he is still in St. Petersburg, and he has been having the most ginormous summit meeting with the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who accompanied him in all the various ceremonies that took place in St. Petersburg to commemorate the siege, the lifting of the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War 80 years ago, and who's been taking actually a very active and very public role in all of these ceremonies and commemorations. It's important to remember that Belarus, like Leningrad, suffered hideously during the Second World War. It lost a quarter of its population during the period of the German occupation. There was intense resistance by the Belarusian partisans right across Belarus, and Belarus played a heroic role in defeating the Germans, but it paid an incredibly heavy price in order to do that. Anyway, Lukashenko and Putin have been having, I won't say one summit meeting, because in fact there's been lots of different meetings, one after the other. It's difficult to keep count. And they've also had a massive meeting of the Supreme Council of the Union State. Belarus and Russia formed what was called the Union State back in the 1990s when President Yeltsin was still leading Russia. It was supposed to prepare the ground for basically the reunification of Belarus with Russia. And many people at the time, by the way, believed that Lukashenko was positioning himself to take over from Yeltsin when Yeltsin retired. Well, that's old history now. But anyway, there's been a massive meeting, vast number of officials participating. Apparently, one of these meetings went on for 8 hours, which is astonishing. Bear in mind that as all of these people talk Russian and talk Russian with each other, we're not talking here about translators needing to interpret the words. So this was a substantive 8-hour discussion. And there's lots of speculation as to what this is all about. Now, there's lots of rumors and claims that the Russians have asked the Belarusians to join the special military operation to participate in the attack on Ukraine, not just to open their border and to allow the Russian army to advance on Kiev again, but to actually send their own army into Ukraine, something which they did not do back in 2022. Well, there may be some of that. I mean, I am not in a position to say one way or the other. My own guess is that Lukashenko has become so concerned about the hostility shown towards him and Belarus by some of the neighboring states, the Baltic states, Poland, and the major exercises that NATO is undertaking around Belarus, that he'll probably want most of his army to remain at home to keep these threats at bay. I can't really believe that he wants Belarus to join in the special military operation. And I think he probably suspects, and he'd be probably right to suspect, that such a move would not be especially popular with the people of Belarus. I think far more likely what is happening is that the Russians and the Belarusians are now working hard towards the complete economic and reabsorption, I would almost say, or at least reintegration of Belarus within the Russian economy. Now, Lukashenko has resisted this in the past. And, well, he's obviously wanted to maintain Belarus's independence, and he's obviously wanted to maintain his own position as the president of an independent country. And the last, perhaps, is less concern to him now, given that most people foresee that at some point, reasonably soon, Lukashenko, who's been in power as president of Belarus for a very long time now, will step aside and retire and make way for someone else. So perhaps he doesn't feel quite the need that he might once have done to preserve Belarus's independence in order to assert his own independence. I'm not sure, by the way, that even this whole line of argument has that much traction. I suspect that Lukashenko is not quite as cynical about these things and as self-interested as people say. But anyway, it may be that if that was a factor, the fact that, as I said, he's due to retire before long makes it less of a concern to him. But I think there is another factor, and I think it's a much, much more important one, which is that one of the reasons why Lukashenko was unwilling to pursue full economic integration with Russia for a very long time was because since the Soviet collapse, there'd been a divergence, a growing divergence between the Russian and Belarusian economic models. Lukashenko in Belarus conducted policies that in some ways resemble Lenin's new economic policy of the 1920s, and which are not that different from the economic policies followed today by China. Big state enterprises remain under state control. The state continues to have a major role in the Belarusian economy. Private business and private industry is allowed to operate and does so very effectively. But as the Soviets used to say, the Bolsheviks used to say, the commanding heights of the economy remain under state control, and the politically very important working class which operates these factories therefore retain their jobs. Well, in the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia pursued different economic policies. It was privatizing, it was closing down or trying to close down big factories. It was pursuing neoliberal shock therapies of a kind that Lukashenko always strongly opposed in Belarus. And Lukashenko would look at all of that and he said, we don't want to have anything like that here in Belarus. If you're in Russia, well, that's up to you. You can do all of that, but we don't want to be part of this. We're going to continue in our own way. And that inevitably means that economic integration between us and you cannot happen. Well, over the last few years, but especially in response to the sanctions pressure that followed from the West's economic war against Russia, which began in February 2022, we have seen the Russian economic model change. And it is starting to look a lot more like the economic model that Lukashenko has built up in Belarus. Russian factories, the big Russian factories, the ones that form the core of the military-industrial complex, they have not only been preserved, but they're now back in business on a massive scale. The state, again, in Russia now controls the commanding heights. It controls the bulk of the energy industry, pretty much the entire banking sector. We're starting to get long-range planning appearing in Russia. And in terms both of economic and social policy, the two models have converged again. And that means that Lukashenko perhaps no longer feels that this is a country that he has to keep distant from. He can work towards further integration with, because that integration is no longer going to threaten the internal domestic stability of Belarus and the livelihoods of the hundreds of thousands of workers in the big state factories in Belarus, places like the Maz factory, which makes these enormous heavy vehicles, all of those, that their livelihoods are secure, because it's in Russia's interests now to keep them secure, and that there isn't a vast flock of Russian oligarchs and minigarchs floating around waiting to pounce on these factories and these businesses if integration is pursued. So I think that integration between Russia and Belarus is now going to accelerate, and I'm not suggesting that Belarus is going to disappear from the map. A politically independent Belarus, I think, remains important for Russia and, of course, for the people of Belarus themselves. But I think we're going to see something much more than just an alliance or a friendship between these two countries. I think that the two economies will, in effect, before very long, become one. And I think it is only a matter of time before a single currency is created to bind the two together, given that they are both the products of the same economic system and are both legacy economies left from the Soviet Union. There is no logical way, no logical reason why a single currency should not be introduced and should not function effectively and successfully as these two economies merge and become one. So I think that is principally what Lukashenko and Putin are talking about with each other. Now, at the end of the special military operation, there will presumably need to be further discussions about Ukraine. And, of course, what Lukashenko and Putin are doing is laying the framework, creating the framework through which whatever is left of Ukraine after this special military operation ends, well, it could be integrated in the same way into this economic and political bloc which we're seeing being created once the special military operation is done. But that's some way off. The Russians still have to win their war. They may be optimistic, increasingly optimistic, that they're going to win it. But as I said, there's still some way to go. Now, all of this contrasts sharply with what is happening in that other big economic bloc on the European continent, which is, of course, the European Union. Because we've had a truly outrageous paper published, or at least circulated by some people within the European Commission and leaked to the Financial Times. And this paper outlines a plan for the economic destabilization of Hungary. And the reason is in order supposedly to punish Hungary and its Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, for the stance that he has taken with respect to Ukraine. Now, I have to say, this is an incredible document. Now, Viktor Orban is a man who provokes strong feelings amongst many people. Again, I'm not always entirely clear quite why, what it is exactly that he's doing in Hungary that is so outrageous and causes such offence. But anyway, I'm going to pass that by. The important thing to understand is that in relation to what Orban and Hungary have been doing with respect to Ukraine, there is nothing validly to complain about. The European Union is supposed to work on consensus. Countries are supposed to have the right to exercise vetoes. Orban exercises his right to veto very sparingly indeed. In fact, principally, he threatens to do it, holds out for terms favourable to Hungary, gets them, and then agrees to whatever package the European Union comes up with. He has never vetoed a single sanctions package against Russia, for example, though he has at times threatened to. So I don't, again, understand what exactly it is that has provoked this hysterical response from the European Commission. Even on this 50 billion euro package for Ukraine, it seems to me that more likely than not, Orban is simply holding out for better deals for Hungary and for himself. By the way, I'm sure the Russians know that and are fine with it. And going out of one's way to sort of crush him and slap him down in this fashion and to provoke a colour revolution in Hungary, which is what this all looks like. It seems a grotesque overreaction. Well, all I would say is two things. The fact that papers like this exist is a sign, well, The Guardian has talked about it, the huge anger towards Orban that exists in European policy circles. The fact that he has been an open skeptic about this, about Project Ukraine all along. But of course, anger, as most people who've encountered it know, is based on fear. And it is clear to me that European officials, the senior leaders of the European Commission, and members, top members of EU governments are now very close to a condition of outright panic. They can see Ukraine going down. It's the great offensive of last summer wasn't just failed, it was defeated. And they can see that Ukraine is cracking along the front lines. They know that the Ukrainians are running out of shells and other equipment and are running out of men. And they know that they have no means to replace those shells and, of course, those men. They are looking at the situation in the United States. They can see that the United States is cooling on Project Ukraine. And beyond that, they can read the opinion polls. They're becoming worried that the next president of the United States is going to be Donald Trump, who has made his skepticism about Project Ukraine abundantly clear and looks likely to pull the rug from underneath it. So all of these European leaders, the European Commission, the German government, under severe pressure, the French government, also under pressure, they are now feeling dangerously insecure and exposed. Because, of course, if Ukraine collapses at a time when the European economy is heading towards long-term stagnation and short-term recession, many people are going to ask and are going to say, well, what then was it all for? Why did Ukraine have to be destroyed? Why did German industry have to be dismantled? Why did Europe have to find itself trapped in this indefinite cul-de-sac when, in the end, Ukraine was defeated anyway? And of course, European leaders can't come out and simply tell the truth. They can't say it was all a terrible miscalculation, that when they launched the sanctions war against Russia in February 2022, they massively underestimated the sophistication and size of the Russian economy and didn't realize how strong it was and how adaptable it would be. They can't admit that they got the international response completely wrong, and that far from being isolated, Russia has managed to isolate them. They can't admit that all those claims about Ukrainian victories were essentially empty air. So, given all that, given that they're afraid that when all the excuses have fallen away and that the debacle is coming and the Americans are walking away from them, given that they fear that at that point they'll be like the emperor, exposed as having no clothes on, they're coming up with crazy plans like this. Go after the one internal dissident, the man who got it right, Viktor Orban, and do it in the most cynical and brutal way by launching an economic war against his country. Now, I have to say this, launching an economic war, the EU launching an economic war against one of its own member states, because that member state has exercised its rights under the Lisbon Treaty to express doubts about EU policies and sometimes to threaten vetoes over them. Well, to me, it smacks of the Brezhnev doctrine, the one that the Soviets supposedly, in fact, they never quite did. This is a bit of a myth in reality, but it's based on some articles that appeared in a Russian magazine, New Times, shortly after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, August 1968, the one that crushed the Prague Spring. Anyway, the legend goes that Brezhnev and the Soviet Politburo enunciated a policy whereby the Soviet Union was under some kind of legal and moral obligation to prevent socialism being reversed anywhere in Eastern Europe, in the former communist countries, and would therefore intervene militarily in order to ensure that socialism in those countries was preserved. As I said, there was never, in fact, any formal announcement of any such doctrine by the Soviet leadership, but never mind. This seems to me to amount pretty much to the same thing. The EU leadership are basically saying that if any country that is a member of the EU acts in a way that might conceivably be seen as calling into question the policies of the EU whole, then the EU leadership is both morally and legally obliged to take action to overthrow the government of that country. The EU is beginning to look like the Warsaw Pact. Who would have thought it? This is what anger and fear and stupid policies obstinately pursued. This is the point they bring you to. Well, that's where I end my program today. We'll see whether the EU does follow up with these threats. We'll see whether Orban buckles in face of them. But anyway, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop where we have all the amazing things that you can buy there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform, to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.